Hello and welcome to this special session on financialexpress.com where we are decoding the interim budget, the interim budget speech, which was just delivered by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. I have with me an elite panel from Deloitte India. If you remember, we had done a pre-budget discussion as well on what we'd expect from the finance minister. And now it's time to see whether she's met those expectations and if there was something more she could have done. Because overall, in my opinion, this interim budget, which was probably one of her shortest budget speeches in the last 6 budgets that she's presented, it was only 58 minutes long, was more of a report card on the government's performance in the last actually 10 years from 2014 to now. Because all through the speech, she kept referring to in 2014 till now, we've done this. And before that, it was like this. So without further ado, I'm going to take this across to a panel. We have Russell Ketonri, who will be talking about direct taxes. I know there were no changes in direct taxes as such. We have Mr. Mani, who looks after indirect taxes at Deloitte India. We have Tarun, who will talk on the personal taxation front, what could have been. But we can actually take a kind of a longer term view on the taxation part. We have Debashish speaking on infrastructure and the outlay. There were some announcements there. And Rajiv Singh, who will talk about automotive, which I think there were significant announcements for the automotive sector, especially when it came to EVs. So let's start in reverse order then. Let's start with Rajiv. Uh, the interim budget 2024, the speech by Nirmala Sitharaman, what do you make of it and specific announcements that she did for EV and job opportunities in the EV space as well?
No,
Rajiv.
see, as you started and you said that it was an interim budget, so I think our expectations from the budget were hence toned to that extent to say that it is interim. We know that the yearly budget is going to come somewhere in July. I think even our honorable finance minister made it very clear. But I think at least we picked up a few directions in this budget, and I would just state a few of those directions that we picked up. One was the direction that we got in terms of the government's commitment and thinking towards electric vehicles, or from a larger perspective, I would say zero emission vehicles, because the finance minister spoke not just about the continued focus on manufacturing and charging infrastructure of EVs. Now, what I read of it is that we do expect a PLI 2.0 to come sometime, maybe post-elections. Currently, we have incentives which are there on the production side for EV manufacturers and the EV component manufacturers. But we have been raising this expectation time and again to say that we want that to be further expanded. And also from a timeline perspective, if it can be expanded beyond the 5 years that we typically get. So we do expect that PLI 2.0 might come given the focus that she spoke about. From a consumer's perspective, while the intent of buying an EV is very, very high, one of the main hindrances in buying an EV is the lack of charging infrastructure in the country. And I think hence it was music to the ears to listen to her, though there was nothing beyond that. I think we'll have to wait for some more time to hear as to what is the government going to exactly do in terms of providing this charging infrastructure in the country. The other element that I picked up very importantly in the budget was she spoke about the 4 pillars. And she spoke about Garib, she spoke about Yuva, she spoke about Annadatta, and she spoke about Nari.
Yeah.
Now, 3 out of these 4 pillars actually focus somewhere on rural India. So whether it is the Nari largely from a perspective, Annadatta clearly from a rural perspective, and Garib as she spoke about, I think what we could see is the rural India is the one where the economy has not yet fully revived. That's the reason why the demand for two-wheelers is specifically, if I look at it, or the demand for small cars has not really picked up. I think going forward, if that is the direction of the government going to be, to focus and try and see how we can revive the rural economy when we see the full budget coming in, I think it'll really boost some of these segments of automotive in terms of consumption of demand. The demand for commercial vehicles, I think, is going well and likely to continue because we see the focus in terms of continuous growth happening. And as you rightly said, the focus on capex and infra build, if that is going to continue, the demand for commercial vehicles will continue. So overall, I would say that it was positive from an industry perspective.
Okay, yeah, she also did mention about electric buses being introduced and an outlay for that. as well as a financing program for that.
And also for the solar rooftops and some
Yes.
schemes, solar charging as well, right? So I think all those were also other positives. That's right.
Right. Mani, if I was to come to you, she said no change in tax slabs, right? No change in direct taxes, no change in indirect taxes. But as you were mentioning a little while earlier, the change didn't really happen in the budget, but out of the budget. Why do you think that was?
So I think it's very interesting that in the past years, we have never ever had a customs duty notification coming one day before the budget. In the last 10 years that I can recollect, I think this is the first time I have seen that, because customs duty notifications normally become part of the budget. And there may be notifications which come maybe 1 month before the budget. I mean, they can be issued at any time during the year. But one day before the budget, we have not seen that. So yesterday, when we saw a notification in respect of the customs duty rates on mobile phone parts, again, not all parts, certain specified parts, being brought down from 15% to 10%, some of us were a little puzzled in terms of, why is that happening on 31st? And my sense was that in the budget discussion today, or in the budget presentation today, the Honorable Finance Minister mentioned that there were no changes at all in respect of taxes. So possibly this would have been otherwise the only change which would have been introduced in the tax. And that is why it has got done, one day, before. But to me, the larger issue in respect of today's, budget, the larger takeaway from today's budget was the Honorable Finance Minister making a specific mention of how successful GST has been, both from the perspective of expanding the tax base and expanding the tax collections. She made it a point to quote data and figures, including data from a survey that Deloitte had done a while back.
Exactly. I was just pointing that out. It was at 94%,
Exactly.
Yeah.
The 94% and 80% came out from, a Deloitte survey, which, we had done some time back. So while she did not mention the name of, Deloitte, she said large consulting firm. I mean, it was a Deloitte survey that she was referring to. We are very privileged that, Finance Minister chose to rely on a Deloitte survey as part of her speech. But essentially what she said was, look, GST has been one of the successful tax reforms that this government has piloted. And the fact that she spent some time explaining how the tax base has expanded, how the tax collections have increased, how the tax has become stable over a period of time, to me, would be a precursor for more GST reforms in possibly July or so when the main budget is presented, or prior to that, once a new government, whichever government gets sworn in, for them to convene a GST Council meeting and come out with a set of reforms to further expand the tax base, rationalize the rates further. We have a multiplicity of rates in GST, which at some point of time have to come down.
Yeah.
We also have to take a call on inclusion of petroleum products. How long can petroleum products be outside the GST purview? So there are quite a few broad level issues like these which, seek attention in GST and which will only enhance the attractiveness of GST as a destination-based consumption tax.
Right.
So to my mind, the fact that the finance minister chose to spend some part of the 58 minutes, that you said, because of the 58 minutes, I, think roughly 6 minutes went into part B of the speech.
Yes.
Of that 6 minutes, possibly significant amount of time got spent on detailing the success factors of GST, which possibly would lay the groundwork for the next budget in terms of the thought process at the government, level. Because any concerns that were there in respect of GST collections coming under pressure are now dissipated, more so with yesterday's, collection, which is at a record high. Any thoughts that people had on, is it really expanding the tax base? That's also gone. It's expanded very rapidly, significantly. Non-flyers are coming into GST. GST remains a tax which is today being correlated with income tax on a big time, manner.
Yeah.
Consequently, we would see possibly more of GST reform when the new government gets sworn in and they come on, board. That, to my mind, was the biggest takeaway from the very short speech that we had today.
Yeah. Russell, if I can get you in here talking about, the total tax receipts. For 24-25, the estimate is 26.02 lakh and total receipts for 30.8 lakh crore. Also, the fiscal deficit, the target was revised. I mean, the estimate was 5.9%, was brought down by 0.1%, 5.8%. And the target is for 24-25 to bring it below 4.5%. What's your view on that, if that's something that's possible?
Yeah, I think it's a realistic estimate, frankly speaking, to get to. The government has been struggling to get it to that 4.5%. This has been there've been talks about this 4.5%, even the first term of the government. But then, of course, there was the pandemic, and things went out of whack. But if they continue going down this path of tax reform, policy changes, it should be quite achievable, because they're moving towards moderate taxes, expanding the tax collection base. She spoke about it in terms of how many new taxpayers have come ever since, even though she's increased the personal income tax minimum threshold limits, the base is widened, and that's kind of adding to the overall revenue base.
Right. And what's your overall take on this interim budget? I mean, I see it as a report card for the government. What's your take on it?
Yeah, it was very it was kind of expected in terms of talking about all the achievements that the government has done over its last 2 terms.
Right.
And even in terms of the changes that were made, and some changes were made on the direct tax side, especially if I look at it's geared more towards financial services, around extending certain sunset clauses that were there in the
From
laws.
31st March this year to the following year.
24 to 25.
Yeah.
So there was an extension given for investments made by notified sovereign wealth funds and foreign pension funds for their investments in qualifying infrastructure projects. That was a welcome move, because the government has actually been evaluating this income tax exemption that they've enacted in the law about 4 years ago. Frankly speaking, the amount of investments that the government would have liked to see under this window, it's not really kicked off to the satisfaction of the government. Though a lot of the foreign pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, they keep representing to the government, asking for an extension of the sunset clause. The conversations now hinder around, okay, we've given this exemption with a sunset clause, but how much have you all actually invested? And it's not that money is not coming in from SWFs and pension funds. Money is coming in. It's just that it's going through other vehicles that are not necessarily notified. So the government was, saying that we'll take a policy decision on this. So if you see, they've extended it only by a year. Ideally, industry was wanting at least a 3 to 5 year extension of time. So that was one. Then some changes around the GIFT City side. Again, for banking clients that want to set up trading desks in GIFT City, they've extended the timeline by 1 more year to 31st of March 2025. And even for aircraft leasing companies to go into GIFT City, they've given them an additional year to set up operations there.
Okay. Yeah. Tarun, staying with taxes, I want to get you in on the personal tax front. Of course, no changes in income tax. I was expecting, being an election year, there might be some slight tweaking to standard deduction or something like that. But I think an interesting fact she did point out was the reduction in the tax processing time, right? From 93 days 10 years ago to just 10 days this year, and you get your refunds almost instantly, right? So anything else you expected on the personal tax front, or where do you and what direction do you see this headed in?
No, so Roshan, as you rightly pointed out, this being an interim budget, so not many expectations were there from a personal tax side. But I would also want to remind you of the budget which was presented like in 2019 by Piyush Goyal. So at that point in time, also from a personal tax side, we were not expecting much of the changes, but there were still some changes in terms of increasing the standard deduction from 40,000 to 50,000. And that's how many of the people were, from a personal tax side, were seeing there may be again some enhancement in the standard deduction this time around also. And not to forget, in 2019 interim budget, there was one more change for working class in terms of houses. So they had allowed 2 houses to be kind of considered as a self-occupy, because typically the middle class
tend to retain one more house for their parents, and then they kind of work in the other cities for jobs and employment. So similar things was expected this time around also from a personal tax front. But then this being, and we not to forget the last yesterday's speech of the Prime Minister, wherein he clearly had mentioned like we will kind of follow the practice of not making too many tweaks and all in this interim budget. So that's how it is. Like and some good aspects, as you rightly pointed out, faster processing of returns, and this has kind of resulted in a faster processing of the refunds as well. We see now in like many of our clients and HNIs, they just whenever their returns are filed within 7 days or 10 days, the returns are processed, and even refunds are kind of credited very quickly within a month or so. So that's been happening. And some good points which finance minister has indicated was that like they've removed the tax demand of like so many years those demands were pending of up to 25,000 till say 2009-10, and the demands outstanding for like up to 10,000 till the financial year
till 2015.
Yes. So that's how they have kind of brought about, and it's again a sort of a more of a budget wherein they've presented what steps they have taken. They had rationalized the new tax regime last year by bringing in some standard deduction, and even like enhancing the tax benefit by making the new tax regime more attractive in terms of earlier it was a 7 slab structure, brought it down to 6 slab structure, and so definitely, and the new tax regime was made as a default tax regime for the taxpayers. So yeah, so it was more of a vote on account budget, so not much changes from a personal tax side was expected. But yes, on the NPS front also, the middle class common people were expecting some tweaks, but yeah, this didn't happen. But definitely in the June or July budget, which will be a full budget, one can expect some tweaks, changes around that, and some tax stops.
Right. Debashish, coming to the infra side, there was quite a bit, I think, announced over there, whether it was, on the green energy side as well, blending of biogas with CNG, liquefaction of coal gas, lots of stuff on infrastructure, railways, 40,000 bogies to be brought up to Vande Bharat standard. So if you can give me a quick overview of what you said, I mean, in the budget, and how do you see that infrastructure push happening over the next few years if this government does, continue?
Thanks, Gautam. I think, yes, I think on the infrastructure side, we saw certain announcement. And on the positive end, and also as Rajiv mentioned, we got a very, very strong direction in which the next budget might have certain programs or schemes. So first of all, she talked about Viksit Bharat. We are talking about yesterday Bharat, and she talked about Viksit Bharat and how modern infrastructure will play a big role about it. She started with that, and then she did announce 11.1% increase in capital expenditure. It was around 10 lakh crores last year. It is 11.11.
11.1, yeah. 11.11 lakh crore this year. Yeah.
So this is 11.11% increase, but in June, July, when the next budget comes in, I'm sure that this will be even more and bigger and larger because infrastructure will be a biggest enabler for the growth that we are seeing now. So I think the Honorable Minister understands that, and that's why at least in this budget we saw an increase of double-digit increase in infrastructure spend. As you correctly pointed out, on railways, she talked about growing the three corridors. The three corridors. She talked about safety and security, which we discussed yesterday as well, improving on that. So in the fine print, maybe when we see the budget, there will be allocations, significant allocations for these. In airways, she talked about new airports and expansion of existing airports. In housing, very interestingly, both in rural housing, 2 crore more housing in the rural areas in the next 5 years, and also a new scheme for middle class. And as we all know, there is an aspiration of middle class of owning a house, and I think we'll look forward to that scheme. And it's a very interesting one, the move that way for middle income group specific scheme coming in. Energy side, you touched upon it. Of course, rooftop solar. She talked about solar energy, also certain viability gap funding for wind. She talked about that as well, and you talked about the CNG part. Also, she talked about the tourism infrastructure
Tourism,
and
yes. And Lakshadweep came up, of course.
the importance of ports, and we talked about inland waterways yesterday, if you remember. The importance of ports and waterways as a transport vehicle, and integrating it as part of the tourism infrastructure that way. And last point, very interestingly, there was one continuation of the loan given to the state government, 50-year interest-free loan, which was introduced last year, if I remember correctly, and it's a continuation of that, the 50-year loan for creating capital for capital expenditure will continue, interest-free for 50 years, and outlay of 1.3 lakh crores for there. So therein also the states can judicially spend it for multiple infra projects, as well. So overall, I think some good announcement, but we will see more in July for sure.
Right. She also mentioned about the FDI inflows from 2014
Yes.
to now. $596 billion has flown into come into the country. And she made it a point to point out that it was twice the inflow of 2005 to 2014. So so all in all, I see it as a report card for the government, being an election year. If I could get a quick take from all of you, Rajiv, if you had to rate this budget announcement, say on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being excellent, where would you put it?
See, it's very difficult, these ratings. It's anyways an interim budget, so let's try and understand that we didn't hence hear a lot of details, but if you force and say what number, probably I'll put 8, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10.
Okay. Money?
I wouldn't put a score. I would just say that, the budget does give some direction to GST, which was, required. And therefore, most of us will be very confident now by saying that once the new government comes in, they are going to work on GST 2.0, so to say, where it will become better and better. I'm sure all of us are aware that the tax system that we have in GST is something which is one of the finest IT-enabled systems worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
There are very few countries which have a great IT-enabled indirect tax system that we have. Hardly anyone has that. Right? And their ability to work on that further and further, to me, is a very, very, welcome step.
Right. Tarun, your take on this?
So probably I'll go with a 7 score, but again, being an interim budget, not much of the expectations can be made out of this. One has to definitely see from a full budget how the government is kind of gonna give more impetus and more stops from a personal tax perspective. What we were still kind of expecting was that maybe from an HRA side, there has been a long demand by the from the common man, is that like you have just introduced 4 cities as metro, and that's how that 50% basic salary exemption is given while calculating HRA. So why not? There are 9 now more cities being and working class spread across, say even Noida, Gurugram, and even Bangalore. So why those cities, and even Hyderabad, those cities should also be accounted for. So that was one, and maybe on a NPS side, which is effectively a retiral benefit, there has to be some stops around that also. Why not increase from 60% exemption to maybe 75%, or entire maybe kind of given as an exempted benefit. So those are the things that the government can make from a personal tax perspective. Well, yes, from a technology side, processing of returns in such a faster pace is really commendable, and that's the reason why we see so many changes. And then the last being is that they are withholding the refunds of the people. Like if there are pending demands of even 10,000, and then the refund amount is say 10 lakhs, so they just withhold that refund. So there has to be some
rationalization.
Rationalization to that front also. But yeah, that's my take on this.
Okay. No, and I just had to quickly ask you one more thing. the new tax regime is now the second. Now this would be the third year, right? Among your fraternity, what's the take? People still sticking to the old regime, or are you seeing en masse movement to the new regime now?
So yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, but yes, like last year, what we saw was there were very less takers of a new tax regime, but bringing in some more kind of benefits, say standard deduction was introduced, and then the rates of the new tax regime was also further rationalized. We have seen many of the people now switching because they don't want to submit those bills
HRA
at,
and yeah,
at
rent receipts and everything.
we are seeing those scrutinies also coming into people opting for the older regimes. So that is one of the way people are now more inclined towards opting for a new tax regime, and that will be the trend. So maybe next year, or maybe like once the new government is formed, we may see that like the new tax regime only is the default, is the regime that people takes care of, and then maybe further stops are given in the new tax regime. Yes.
And Debashish, your take on the budget, a score of where it stands, and how would you rate it?
So being an interim budget, I'll give an 8 because I think on infrastructure front, there's very clear direction that spending will be higher, and also focus on green and sustainability. That's the other focus. Focus of inclusiveness, because rural housing and rooftop solars in decentralized power. So all those things are important, and also focus on the multimodal transport and freight and logistics that way. So I'll give an 8 out of 10, but expect more in July for sure.
Right. Okay. Russell had to drop out because he had another pressing engagement. But anyway, so I would like to thank you, gentlemen, for joining me for this post-budget session. And so that was a vote on account budget. This is Deloitte's take on the budget. And we look forward to the full budget in June, July, and look forward to having you all back again then to talk about the budget. Of course, we'll meet for many other things in between now and then. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.